Going to quickly go over the topics we're going to cover today. So first I'm going to talk about what security was like prior to 5.4, and that will give you a little bit of context as to why we made the changes we made and help you hopefully understand how you can add on to your security that you already have set up if you're an existing Informer customer. I also want to point out that all of the changes are 100% backwards compatible, and that means that any changes that were made aren't going to affect the way that your Informer is now, and that was designed specifically to make it easy for you to upgrade. You can pick and choose what you want to take in or not use, so 100% backwards compatible. We wanted to offer more flexibility and control. So one thing people have asked for and we now offer is the ability to grant access to specific fields in a data source. We also allow people to add more than one mapping set to their mappings, and we introduced field sets, which are similar to mapping sets but at the field level, and they're mainly used for organization rather than security. And then finally, we're bringing down to the data set level the ability to use all of the settings you have on your data source and take advantage of those when you go to share your data sets. So if you're new to Informer, some of those terms might be a little bit new to you as well. So the first thing I'm going to do before we get into the live demo is for me to just go over what some of these terms are and to talk about the changes in the field level security. So a data source in Informer is your connection to your production data. That usually is a database, although nowadays REST APIs and other ways to connect to data are also data sources. But the idea is that a data source is your data that you're going to be querying. You're going to write queries off your data source. Informer comes bundled with a database and data source called Northwind. It's a Postgres database, and we use this for our training. So this is what I'm going to be talking with today. And if you wanted to play around with it, it should be available under administration features in Informer. So Northwind has some tables in it, and they have a couple that I'm showing here, employees and customers. So these are tables on the database, the list of employees, the list of customers, and their related columns. So first and last name, the birthday of the employee, their phone number and address, and similar for customers, their contact information and where they live. So if I were to go into this fresh and want to secure this data source and be able to share it out to my users in Informer, the first thing I would do would be to go through those mappings that I wanted to secure and then flag them as restricted. So a mapping is sort of like the table, but it's a layer on top of it. It's sort of like Informer's version of that table that lets you do things like customize the labels. So sometimes the column names are a little abbreviated or not readable, so you have the opportunity to make them prettier or more understandable for your query authors. You can also do things like set default formatting options for the field. If it's like a number, you might want to show it as a dollar amount or something like that. So a mapping is like a layer on top of the table that Informer lets you do stuff with. And one of the things you can do with it is to apply security. So for mappings, you can group them together in logical sets. For fields, you can mark them as restricted. So for things that are personally identifiable information in Northwind, I'll just mark them with a little lock and Informer, and then that means they are restricted. So what does that really mean? Well, that means when you go to share the data source and let people query off of it, at that point, you'll be able to determine whether those people can see the restricted field or not. So say I have 3 teams in Informer. You can also share directly to a user, but a lot of times it makes more sense to share to a team because then you can add more users to that team and you don't have to have the same security settings over and over for every user. So say I have 3 teams here. I've got my admin team, I've got my HR team, and my sales team. So my admin team, they're going to need everything. They need full access to this data source because they're the ones that do all the really advanced querying, and they need to have it all. Then I've got the HR team. And the HR team needs all of the employee fields because that's what they work off of. Whereas the customers, that contact information is need to know, and we want to keep our customers' information as private as possible, so they don't need to have the restricted fields on customer. And then we've got the sales team. Well, the sales team contacts all of the customers through phone. They don't really need the address or mobile number. Maybe that's just used for the billing team. So really, they can get by without any restricted fields on either one of these mappings. So in 533, which is the previous version of Informer, no problem, we can totally handle that scenario. You would give the admin team full access to the entire data source. You would give the HR team full access to the employees and restricted access to customers, which means they don't get those restricted fields, they just get the ones that don't have a lock. And then you've got your sales team, and then they can have both tables, but they're both under restricted mode, like none of the lock tables. So that works fine. But then we started getting some feature requests from our customers saying, well, I've got the situation where my HR team needs just the address. I don't really want to give them the mobile number for our customers, but they need the address because they're about to do some kind of geographic study. And my sales team, well, they don't really need the address, but they need the mobile number because they're about to do some sort of texting campaign. So we need to grant just the mobile number, but not the address, and vice versa for the HR team. So how would you accomplish this in 533? Well, the answer is we added that for 5.4. So now we're going to offer the ability to do just this, and I am going to show you how it works next. So quick recap, we're going to show how to grant fields individually, how to add more than one mapping set to a mapping, how to add field sets to fields, why you would want to, and then finally, I'm going to show you how you can bring all this hard work on your data source into securing your data set. So, on to Informer. Here I'm logged in as the system administrator, and I am going to go to my data sources page. This is where my Northwind data source lives, the one that I was just showing you on that other slide. And if I double click into it, what it does is it's going to show me all of the mappings that are part of this data source. And again, these are like the tables. In fact, you can see here, this column shows you what the table name is on the database, whereas what's the pretty name that we've decided to give the mapping, which gets defaulted for you is a logical name for it. And then you'll see this third column says mapping set. So when you have only 24 mappings, like in this Northwind orders data source, it's not super useful to be able to categorize these things, but you can see how it could be nice if you've got a lot of related tables like customer underscore this, customer underscore that. It would be nice just to like say, okay, well, this is like the customers. And that's what mapping sets gives you, the ability to say this is like logically one set of things. And so later when you go to do security, it might be useful to you at that point to be able to like apply security rule for that group of mappings. So in 5.4, we introduced the ability to assign more than one. As of now, until 5.4, you could only pick one. So you had to pick one mapping set. You couldn't have it be part of more than one group. But now you can, and we changed the UI a little bit. You'll notice usually the filters are on the left here, but we have a new drop down on the upper right. The main reason for this is because if you've had a lot of mapping sets, which some people had to do because they couldn't add more than one before, the page loaded a little bit slower. So now it loads really fast, and they're all up in this little drop down, and it's searchable, because if you have it over here, not as easy to search for it. So here, if I pull down this drop down, I can see all of the mapping sets here, and if I check the boxes, I get an immediate reaction from the list below. So likewise, it's really fast to type in here, so searching through your mapping should hopefully be a pleasant experience because it does react quickly to your input. If you wanted to add or change a mapping set, you can do it one at a time or in bulk by selecting the rows, and there's an actions button that appears on the info sidebar. So here's where you can perform your actions. There's a mapping set, so you can clear it, you can make a new one on the fly and assign it to the ones you have selected. And you can also bring up this dialog, and here's where you check off all of the mapping sets that you want to apply to this mapping. If you wanted to change the color or the label of a mapping set, there's a link here in the left side nav to be able to navigate to all the mapping sets, and you can make a new one from here as well. If you want to modify one, you double click on it and you can change the color, the icon, the name, whatever you like. So that's mapping sets. As far as the fields go, that's where the new field sets UI is found. So I can go into employees here. This is my employees mapping for North One orders. You can see I've already taken the opportunity to mark some of these fields as restricted. But just to show you how you do it, if you select one or more, the action menu allows you just to click on a restrict. So it's a single click operation in this menu, and the little row here gets the icon, and then if you want to unrestrict, it's the same operation. You just click unrestrict and it goes away. So that's how you can quickly highlight multiple at a time and mark them as restricted all at once. And then this field set column is new in 5.4 as well. And field sets are mainly for filtering. So it's to get to the fields really quickly. Where this really comes into play to be super useful is later when you go to share the data source, you're going to see all the fields across all the mappings in one place to be able to grant them. So it's nice to be able to have these field sets if you're trying to narrow it down really quickly into a specific category. So it's up to you what you want to use them for. It doesn't have to be restricted fields that are given a field set. Say you could have all of your location-based fields like city and address and country, maybe mark those with location. Or maybe you might want to instead use it as a Y for why it's restricted. So maybe you mark this photo as restricted, and so you can have a field set called like personal information. Or if it's like salary or something, you could have like financial. And that way, when you go later to grant these fields, you'll kind of have a why or a grouping of the fields for logically why you would want to share them or not to a specific role or team. So that's how you secure a field. Similar to mapping sets, there's a page where you can manage your field sets. Same exact thing. You can change the color, the icon, and the name of the field set. That's located in the left sidebar, side nav, just like the dataset mappings were for the mapping sets. All right, so that's how you set up whether the fields are restricted or not. You can assign mapping sets, you can assign field sets, similar UI here. You can grab the field set from this menu here, make a new one on the fly. And so that's how you manage that part of it. Now, when you go to share this data source, you want to give your users and informer the ability to query off of this data source. So to do that, what I'll do is go into Access. And I'm going to remove the ones I already have here so we can make them from scratch. So when you first come to this page, this is what it's going to look like. It'll show you who the owner is currently of the data source, and then there'll be a toggle for whether or not to share it. And of course, the owner would be the one to decide whether or not you could share it. So if I turn on sharing, I get a box below that says sharing is enabled, but it hasn't been shared to anyone yet. So if I click on the button below to add a user or team, this is a new UI in 5.4 that gives you a full explanation of the different ways in which you can share the data source to the different users. So the top box that's bordered in this gray line up here, it automatically puts your focus to type in here because this is the first thing you need to decide, like who are you trying to share this to? So in my slides earlier, I had 3 teams, so we'll just talk about those 3 teams and do the security here that I showed in the slide. So one of them was the admin team. For the admin team, I wanted to give them complete access to the data source. So this is the easiest one because all I have to do is hit save at this point because the bullet, the radio button for full access has already been selected here. So if you read the description, it says all the fields and mappings are granted for full access and they can use any query editor. Informer has a query designer, which is like a field chooser and a criteria designer. And in the query designer, we allow the mapping security and the field security to limit what the user can even do and see. And so it makes it is not as wide open as, say, a just giant text area or SQL editor for just copy pasting in SQL or writing SQL. So the native SQL editor is a little bit more wide open, and so that's why only people with full access to the data source are able to use that editor. So these checkboxes, kind of like a comparison chart here that tells you what the difference is. So I want this admin team to have full access. So then I'm going to go and I'm going to add my human resources team. And I said that for them, I didn't want them to have any of the customer information, just the employee information. So for them, I would say they have restricted access. Restricted access means they have to be explicitly granted any field that we want to give them. They can run it, if you share a query with them off this data source, they can run it, and they can use the query designer, but they can't use the native SQL editor. And then as far as whether they can access the mappings or the restricted fields, well, that kind of just depends on the next two tabs. So I'm going to skip over this tab because I think that for most cases, the next step makes the most sense to not worry about the mapping sets and just go straight for the restricted fields. Because a lot of times you've already identified in your data source what fields are restricted. And so here is where it just makes most sense to just go directly to this tab and grant the ones you want this team to have. So here I've got a search bar and a drop down for the field set. So say I had financial or personal information. What I can do is click on that in the drop down, and then it just shows me those fields, and I could say add all. Or just click individually which ones I want to grant permission. I can also use this search box to make it pretty easy to narrow it down too. So in this case, I really wanted the HR team to have all of the employee fields. So I can type in employee. I notice on my mapping column that they're all from the employees. So I can click add, or just add all and hit save. And so now it shows me that the human resources team has restricted access and they've got 6 fields granted to them. Oh yeah, and I also wanted to give them the customer's address. So I'll do that now too. So now they have 7 fields granted to them. And then last but not least, my sales team here. I also want to give them restricted access, and I wanted to give them the mobile number. But of course, this database was from like the 90s, and so we don't have mobile number, we have fax. So we'll just pretend that says mobile. All right, so the sales team gets the fax number, has 1 field granted, and human resources gets 7. So if I did want to use the mapping set feature, here's what that looks like. So say I've got thousands and thousands of mappings in my data source, and it's really cumbersome to scroll through that many restricted fields to be able to secure them. And I'd rather just do it as a logical grouping, say these they get all, these they get some. So that's what the mapping sets tab is for. So it gives you an info blob to explain what I just explained, but essentially when you turn on mapping set access, what you get to decide is for each mapping set, what do you want to give this team? So for human resources, I could say they get all of the staff and all of the territory mappings. They get full, all restricted fields are automatically granted. If you want them to not have any access, the mapping won't even show up. You can choose none. And then of course in the middle is restricted, and that means that you have to grant those fields the same way as if you weren't customizing by the mapping set. And so what you'll notice if you choose restricted, then when you go to the restricted fields, only the fields from these mappings are going to show up. The ones where you've granted full access, you don't have to re-add them in the restricted fields tab because you've already granted them by way of this radio button. So now when I go to restricted fields, you'll notice all the employee mappings are just not showing here. And in fact, there's a message saying they're not here because you've already granted them in that mapping sets tab. So in this case, because we're only dealing with less than 10 fields, I really would say this is the best approach just because it's easier to follow. And it's easier also to read from this page because it's not saying it depends on the mapping set, and then you have to go look. So this, I think, is the best approach for a lot of cases, is just to go ahead and go straight to the restricted fields. So now that we've got this set up, I'm going to show you what it's like when we share a query. So I'll go to reports, and I'm going to make a new query. And this is what I was talking about with the native SQL, which is like the big fancy editor, which is basically a big text area with syntax highlighting and autocomplete. But then there's the query designer, and this is the one that is more of a user friendly. If you don't know how to write SQL, you can design a query using the query designer. So for this, I'll say, this is my webinar, customers query. And I'll pick Northland as my data source and customers as my mapping. So now when I go to add fields, I get all the fields here because I am the admin. If I were somebody in one of those two teams, I would only see the fields that I'm allowed to see in this dialog. Okay, so I'll save this, and you can see what it looks like when I get the results. All right, so now I want to share this query and let other people run the query. Here I'd go to access for the query and share it. Same UI as the data sources. You click on the add button to pick who you want to share it with. There really aren't too many options here other than just picking who you want to share it with. So I'll say I want to share it with the human resources team and the sales team. All right, so if I'm going to go to two different browsers here to show you what it looks like from these people's perspectives. In my teams here, I've got some members in HR and sales. So I've got two different browsers open. Here is my HR person. And if I go to my news feed, that webinar was just shared with me. Webinar customers query was just shared with me a few seconds ago. That's the one. I could also get to it from reports. All right, so now if I run this query, my settings should be such that I see the address, but I don't see the fax number. And that is what I'm seeing here. Now, if I go to this is a sales member, and I go to the report that was just shared with me, and I run it. Now, I am not going to see address, but I will see their fax number. So what happens is when you make a query and then you share it out to the different teams and users, it's going to use their data source access to determine what field should get stripped out before revealing to you what the results are. Similarly, if I were to go and make a new query as one of these users, I wouldn't even be presented the fax number field as an option if I am the HR person, and I would not even be presented with address field as an option if I am the salesperson. So that is how the query access works. Now going into the dataset security. First, let me just talk about what a dataset is. So when you run a query, the results are staged just for you, your user at that moment in time. Whereas a data set is a little bit different. A data set is run and then the results are the things you share. So these are used to back reports. So if you want to make a dashboard, if you want to make a custom data view, which is basically the grid, but you also get to see like different sorts and groups and filters. That's a data view. So you can build multiple of those data views off of one data set. So you're not constantly hammering your production system, but people can share the same result sets. Works really great for historical data, or if you've got a lot of records and you don't want to hammer your production system with a bunch of queries when everybody is trying to get the same data, it makes a lot of sense to have a data set. So when you share a data set, version before 5.4, you can choose what rows they see. So if you have a filter, like I want to say I only want to see the USA orders, I can have this filter, and then when I share out the data set, okay, only the USA orders should be shared to the HR team. But you couldn't control what columns they see. When you share a data set, it's almost like you're sharing the data set. It's like the spreadsheet almost. There was no way to control, well, these people can see these columns and these people can see these columns. The index is kind of separated from where it came from. Because one thing about a data set too is it doesn't necessarily go straight from a query to results. There are flow stats, you can add script fields, and so really the data set's its own thing. But still, we can know where the data came from in a lot of cases. And so we offer now the ability to take all that hard work you've done on your data source security for securing the fields and being able to bring that down into the data set level. So what does that look like? If you go to any of your data sets, I'll go to this one for employees. And there's a fields page right here under the pie chart for visuals. It says fields. This is referring to all of the fields that are on the data set. Before in 5.3.3, we introduced script fields, or 5.3, we introduced script fields. And those are fields that happen after the data is indexed. So that's where this page originated from. But we added some stuff to it in 5.4 that allows you to manage the security for this data set. So this mapped field column is brand new, as well as the source and restricted. It used to just be the field name and alias. So when you have a field that came from the query designer or from a native SQL for certain types of data sources, then Informer can learn the metadata about the query results and then tell you where these data set fields originated from. So when I ran this data set, it automatically pulled in this information. Like it knows that address came from the employee's address and birthday came from employee's birthday. And if you have links, it'll say like what mapping and what field it came from. And then as you can see, it knows that it's restricted. And so it doesn't at that point stamp out that it's restricted at the time it ran. It's a live pointer to the data source. So now that I've said that, address is restricted, if I go to the data source and I unrestrict that field, it would show unrestricted here too. So it always has a live link and it defers to the data source as far as what fields are secure and which aren't. But there are some fields that we just don't know where they came from necessarily. One example would be a flow step field. If you add a script, you could put anything in that script. So we don't necessarily know where that came from. And some fields are script fields. So for example, maybe I wanted to have an age off of birthday. So I could say there's a new script field time between. So I could say age, and then I wanted to have it from birthday to now and show how many years that would be. All right, so I've got age now, and we don't know where that came from, so we'd have to tell Informer here where that field came from. So if I double click on it, I could have done this when I created the field, but there's an inherit security feature. So here I can say, what do I want to secure age as? And logically, I'd want to secure age as the birthday. So you could say, this is the same thing as employee birthday. And so when I save it, it's going to say, even though it's a script field, it's going to point to the birthday as far as security goes when you go to share it. And similar for location, I'll probably want to secure this the same thing as the postal code. So I could say the employee's postal code is how I determined what this location was. And so secure it as if it was the postal code. So now when I go to share the data set, that's where this comes into play. So similar to the other pages, there's a toggle on or off. So if sharing's on, I now get this button to add a share setting. So I'll go to my human resources and my sales teams. And here are the two settings I can choose. Row level security has been there. That's been there for a long time. That's where you can pick your save filters, USA only or whatever, to be able to share, and that limits the rows that come back. The field level security is the new one. That is what determines which columns or fields that they can see when they go to view this data set. The default for this is to allow all fields, and this goes back to that backwards compatibility thing I talked about. I wanted to make sure that we all wanted to make sure that you didn't have to go and figure out a new workflow if you're already using Informer. So this defaults to the behavior that it has before 5.4, which is to allow all fields. If you want the data source security to be applied here, that's what this new radio button's about. And you get this big info message explaining the fact that you have to do what we just did to assign those script fields like where they belong. It just doesn't automatically happen. You have to look to see, make sure all of those fields are filled out if you want to secure them, and we don't know where they came from. So that's what this message is explaining. Now, if you came from an older version, or if you're before 5.4 and you're upgrading to 5.4, this mapped field column is new. We just introduced this in 5.4. So previous data sets, they haven't written out this information. So you would either need to refresh them, or there's a button to do that for you. So this linked field definitions button, what that does is it gets all of this mapped field information without having to run the full query. It doesn't get any records. It just asks the database for the most brief version of the information to fill out this information. So you can just hit it once. We did have it where you just hit the button and then it said, okay, good. But then people wanted to know what just happened. So we have this dialogue now that's explaining what's happening. But what it's doing is it's going out and it's populating this map field column, which it's already filled out for this data set. So you won't really see any change there. But you can do that for your existing data sets without having to refresh them, and you'll be able to get this information. Likewise, you don't have to go into every data set. We have this as a bulk action. So if you have more than one, you just highlight all the ones that you want to be able to link. And then there's an action with a little spyglass here, or a magnifying glass. It says link field definitions. So you click on that, you get the same dialogue. It goes through them in order, so it's not going to blast 3 queries out at once. It's going to do one, then it's going to do the next one, and then it's going to do the next one. So what that does is it goes through, links those fields, and then updates the data set with those mapped fields. All right, so then I'm going to go and show you what those data sets look like from the perspective of these two users. So one of my users is the HR guy. And here's the data set that was just shared to me. See, did I actually share it? Let me just check. Yes, I did. Okay, employees. So here it is. And when I go and view this data set, you'll notice that I have all of the fields because I am the HR person, and the salesperson does not have all the fields. So they don't get the birthday or the age, but they do get the location because we granted address. So those two show how dataset security works. Now let's talk more about this radio button here. We do want it to be backwards compatible, which is why allow all fields is still the default. But we also don't want people to have to go into every single data set share, which is where this choice is made, and have to update it to that radio button to use data source security and then worry, oh, did I get all of them? So there is also a system setting now under admin. If you go to administration, settings, there's a security section down here, and it says always inherit dataset field security from the data source. For datasets that have fields associated with the data source, use the data source security. without the system setting, the choice is made per each data source or dataset share. So if you click on this, that same note that talked about how you have to link the field definitions is there. And really this is just for old data sets, because new ones that you make, that's automatically filled out when you create, run, and refresh the data set. That's all updated. It's really for older data sets and fields that did not come directly from a query, such as a calculated column in a field step or a script field from that age, time between, or Elasticsearch script. So those all need to be pointed to what you want to secure them as. But all the ones that came from a query in 5.4 will have that information populated. But this is just letting you know that, so you don't forget that just turning this on magically does it. That does have to have that link in order to know where the dataset fields came from. So now that that's on, if I go into the data set again, and I go look at how I would share, instead of having those two radio buttons for allow all fields and defer to the data source field security, now you just get this info saying that the system setting to force the dataset field security has been turned on in administration settings. Any field on this dataset that has a mapped field associated with it cannot be viewed unless the user or team also has access to the data source. So that leads to a new use case that we've never had before. What if you want to have the data source security and when you want to use that to secure your data set, but you don't want to allow the user to do any querying at all? Like you just want them to have the data set access. That is now shown in a third radio button in the data source share screen. So if I go back to my Northwind data source and then I go into access, you might have noticed there is a third radio button I didn't talk about in here. So this is the dataset only access. This radio button is there so that you can restrict fields when you share a data set, but you don't want them to query off of this data source, because both full access and restricted access imply that you want them to be able to run queries. But when you have data set only access, really this is kind of like a restrict only operation. So you're not allowing them to perform any querying on a data source, but since you've shared the data set with that option turned on to secure the fields, you want to be able to give them access to those fields. So that's where this third radio button comes in. So if I add, let's say, I'm sure I have another team in here. What's another one I've got, like marketing team or something? So marketing team, say I want to give them data set only access. They don't need to do any querying. Well, in this case, the description says no query access that can be used to secure data sets. They cannot, if you share a query with them, they can't run it. They can't use the query designer. They can't use the native SQL editor. They can't access the mappings to do their own querying. All they can do is view the data set you've shared to them, and only then the fields that they're allowed to see. So in this case, the mapping set tab is grayed out because it's really not relevant for this data set only use case. But if I want to allow the marketing team to see some of those restricted fields that are on my data set, I can do that here. So I can say, all right, I want them to be able to see, the age of the employees. And then that's it. So now they have data set only access, and they will only be able to see the birthday and age. They won't be able to see any of the other restricted fields on that data set. So that about wraps up the demo for the field security. I know some of you may have some questions. So before we end, if you want to enter those questions into the sidebar for GoToWebinar, what we'll do, since there's so many people on the line, we'll just go ahead and compile those questions. And then after this, we're going to answer them and get back to you via email. You can also email us if for some reason you couldn't get to the GoToWebinar before it ends to enter your question. And we will answer them as fast as we can. But I hope that this solves all of your issues with the dev team and everybody here. We really do care about the problems you guys face, and hopefully this makes your life a lot easier and more flexible. And if you have any issues or anything, just please let us know. So thanks again so much for attending today, and hopefully I will see you all soon. Take care.